Author Sam Tanenhaus opens his acknowledgement section in his latest book, Buckley, this way. Quote, I first met William F. Buckley in 1990, shortly after I had begun work on a biography of Whitaker Chambers, close quote. Tanenhaus continued, Bill Buckley had been Chambers' last patron and most eloquent champion. The biography of Chambers was published in 1997. Now, 28 years later, Sam Tanenhaus finished his 1,018-page book on the life of William Buckley Jr. Quote, within months of our first conversation, Bill Buckley had opened doors, uncovered grant money, made phone calls, and performed innumerable other kindnesses, large and small. Sam Tanenhaus, how did you change your mind about Bill Buckley over the 27 years you spent thinking and writing about him?
Well, I didn't really change my mind about him. I admired him and liked him going into the project. Brian, he seemed to me larger than life, and that's how I felt at the end. Now, what happened along the way, it always does in books like this, is I learned things about him and his family and the conservative movement I had not known before. But that's why we write the books, is to investigate and explore. But they never changed my mind, and I never changed my mind about William F. Buckley Jr. Bill Buckley, as everyone who knew him called him, including people who worked in the mailroom at his magazine, National Review, which was one thing I admired about him so much, was the ease, the social ease, not only that he himself had, but that he gave you. And I was a very young person when I got to know him. You know about this very well because it was the writing of the first big biography I did, Whitaker Chambers. Bill Buckley was a great gatekeeper and knew Chambers, the only person at that point in the 1990s who'd really been close to Chambers, who died. He himself died, Chambers, in 1961. And yet Buckley invited me into his world and was the only person I encountered who was part of the large and rightfully angry population of people who thought Chambers had not been treated fairly and kindly. And I agreed with that, and I still do. Bill Buckley was the only person who said, this book is not just about restoring Whitaker Chambers' reputation. It's about you as a young writer trying to do good work. And I thought, this famous man is actually taking an interest in me. I had never encountered that before. So I thought, okay, this is the next guy I want to write about. My opinion never changed.
You say that between the years 1774, no, 1974, you're not that old, 1974 and 1980 was a time of near personal ruin and improbable recovery. What were you talking about?
Well, it's so interesting, Brian, because one of the things I learned in the course of exploring the life of Bill Buckley was how many reversals and disasters had befallen him in his personal life. And a lot of them had to do with finance. You know, he was a son of a wealthy, self-made oil explorer. Wildcatter is the term that's used, though it's not quite accurate. Buckley Sr., William F. Buckley Sr. was not a guy who was going off to the hinterlands and, or the forests and jungles and digging oil wells. He was an investor and speculator, but he made and lost fortunes. And even when he had great success, he was so over leveraged, that is, he had borrowed so much money and had floated so much stock that he didn't really earn profits, or the profits were very small. And Bill Buckley's older brother, James Buckley, who became U.S. Senator and federal judge, one of the few men of his time to have serve in senior positions in all three branches of the federal government, because he was also in the State Department at one point. Well, he told me, Jim Buckley did, the father never made any money. made very, very little, but he lived as if he had. And Bill Buckley inherited that same recklessness and daring about his ventures. Hey, without that, you wouldn't get the conservative movement. He had to take a lot of risks. He had to bring in a lot of people who later turned out to disappoint or even betray. And he had to take a lot of chances. That's how he lived. It's also how he lived his personal life. So there were many reversals. He was on the brink of bankruptcy in 1974. And when his son, Christopher Buckley, came back from Yale, Bill Buckley said to him, his father said to him, "We're on the brink of ruin. I may have to sell the house you're living in." And that was because of overinvestment in a series of radio stations, and then the formation of a privately held company that was really flirting with illegality. In fact, the Securities and Exchange Commission investigated him. So that was one of his setbacks. The other one, Brian, was a personal setback. The death row inmate, Edgar Smith, whose cause Bill Buckley had taken up. And I explore it in some detail in this book. And people ask me, why? Why are you writing about this mistake Bill Buckley made when he was deluded by this con man murderer? The reason I wrote about it was because Bill Buckley was so invested in it. He talked to me about Edgar Smith the entire time I knew him. After Edgar Smith had died, he felt his misplaced trust in Edgar Smith was an important incident and event in his own life. A man of faith like Bill Buckley was always flirting with delusion. That is, misplaced faith. You believe in something so much you can't see clearly anymore. Well, while all that was happening in his personal life and his family's financial life, Bill Buckley also came in at this moment in the conservative movement when it really looked like the extremist forces that were rallying behind the Alabama segregationist and populist George C. Wallace, not very well remembered today, though you know a great deal about him. Anyone who followed politics in that era, the 1970s and before them the 60s, through the 80s, was very well aware of George Wallace. He was in some ways a progenitor of the populism we've seen since. And Bill Buckley thought he was bad news. And he said, if the true leader of the movement, whom he already saw, was Ronald Reagan, if he's going to rise to the top, there can be no association with George Wallace-style populism, which other people on the right, including the publisher of National Review, Bill Rusher, William A. Rusher, and Patrick Buchanan, who's actually a pretty good friend of mine. Patrick Buchanan's a fascinating and brilliant figure. They were trying to create a coalition between Ronald Reagan and George Wallace, which they thought would create a new populist movement that would capture disaffected voters in both parties. Interesting, Brian, because we look ahead today to the Trump coalition, MAGA coalition, and we say, well, Rusher and Buchanan were kind of right. You could put together these unusual factions of what were then called forgotten Americans or middle Americans, and now are called the Make America Great, right, again, coalition, and built a popular party out of it. And Buckley wanted nothing to do with it. He really believed in what he thought of as the higher values of intellect and argument and reason. And above all, his great cause was defeating communism. And it was in those same years, the mid-1970s, that the U.S. and much of the liberal elite who had been anti-communist were pulling away from that anti-communist cause, including President Jimmy Carter, who'd given a famous speech at Notre Dame University in which he said, maybe we're a little too fixated on the communists. Let's worry about human rights. And Bill Buckley, in one of the greatest speeches he ever gave, which I write about at length, also at Notre Dame University, said, human rights. How are the Soviets doing on human rights about now? What about the physicist they've locked up without a fair trial? And all of this sounded reactionary until Americans heard dissident voices like Alexander Solzhenitsyn, Václav Havel, the great Czech writer Milan Kundera, these dissident voices behind the Iron Curtain who were saying the same things Bill Buckley did. So I've talked to a couple of younger people younger than me, in their 40s and 50s, who were the children of Soviet emigres, Russian emigres, Jews who came to the United States. One of them is the very famous novelist Gary Steingart, whom I encountered at a book event the other day. And he said, I have to tell you, to my family who came over from Russia, Bill Buckley was a hero. He was an idol. He's someone we looked up to. And there's a writer, Larry Perlman, who's written a memoir, who also was the son of Jewish emigres from Russia, who said the same thing about Buckley. So at the same time his life was unraveling, Bill Buckley remained as dedicated as ever to this great anti-communist cause and insisted that his disciple Ronald Reagan stay true to it, stay the course on that.
Let me stay with the money for a second, because you reveal in this book how much he was paid to do Firing Line. $11,500 for each episode, 44 a year, $1,500 over the lifetime of the program when he did it. Was that $11,500 back then or now?
Back then, at 1971. You know, one thing you do, and it's an interesting thing writers like me do when we do his history and biography. I see behind you, Brian, The Power Broker by Robert Carroll, who is a model for me and someone I'm proud to call at least a friendly acquaintance. I've written about him and we've talked about this. One thing he does in his books, and I also do in mine, is not give an older figure and say how much that number is worth today. Why? Because what's it going to be worth 10 years from now? It actually freezes you in your moment when you think you're illuminating the moment. So when I found that he was paid $11,500 per episode, 1971, and I'll tell you in a second how I learned that, I thought, just put that figure there. And in the age of Google, any person can look it up and do an inflation calculator. You know, there are many of them on Google, and they'll tell you what that money is worth today, which is a lot more. The interesting thing about that is Bill Buckley did not hold on to that money. Didn't I just say he was facing personal bankruptcy? What happened to that money? That money went into his magazine, National Review. Almost all the money Buckley earned from his outside literary and media work, which was substantial, right? He was the biggest, in some ways, the biggest media guy of his time, certainly the biggest ideological media guy of his time. That money got plowed into National Review, or that magazine would have gone out of business.
We've just been through a period where Donald Trump and the Congress took money away from the public broadcasters. But over the years, the big names have their own production companies. And so you never know how much they're making. And back then, Bill Buckley had his own production company. But do you know, with that kind of money, and we're talking today, millions and millions of dollars that he earned off of that went into the magazine. Where'd the money come from?
Well, that's right. It was an outfit set up. Here's the tricky part: in South Carolina. And initially, when Bill Buckley did the program, it was done on WOR TV in New York. New Yorkers remember it as Channel 9, a local network. The Joe Franklin show was on it. He did a little studio on 40th Street. Then that show was not. There's another surprise about Firing Line, which is so admired, and rightfully so. I mean, there's never been a debate program like it. What you do is different. You're doing interviews. He was combining interviews and debates. And you go on YouTube and see some of the best. Watch Bill Buckley and Muhammad Ali debating on Elijah Muhammad and Malcolm X, with Buckley siding with Malcolm X and Muhammad Ali defending Elijah Muhammad, and you almost can't believe what you're watching. But there it was, 1968. Well, the program was not really doing all that well. And when they had the opportunity to go to public broadcasting, PBS, Buckley was all for it. That's why Buckley was one conservative who never said PBS should be defunded, because you'll remember it was happening back in those days. And that's how I found out how much he earned. Why? Because after Richard Nixon came into office, congressional conservatives who were suspicious of public broadcasting demanded an accounting. How much money were all these people being paid, and who was paying it? And it turned out it was the government that was paying it. Only that money would go to the production company. So the South Carolina production company actually was getting its money for the government, and then they channeled it over to Bill Buckley. So he was really getting federal money to do this, taxpayer money to do it, and he knew it. And that's why he said he was all for it. He had the integrity not to pretend it was anything different from what it appeared to be. Well, Brian, what they found was when they demanded the records for PBS hosts, the highest paid host through PBS itself, the highest salaried host, was Bill Moyers, was being paid the large sum in those years of $75,000 a year, which was a lot less than he'd gotten at CBS, by the way, when he left and went over. The famous personalities like Julia Child, who did her cooking program, Alistair Cook, who did the famous Masterpiece Theater introductions on PBS, Arthur Fiedler and the Boston Pops. These are the very big names. They were getting something like $500 a week. And Bill Buckley was getting $11,000 because his production company was so bare bones. They had almost no overhead. You saw it. I was on that program once. You sat in a little chair in a very blank studio with a couple of cameras, and that was that. Bill Buckley wrote the introduction himself. Those very witty introductions. I quote the very first one in the book, just so readers can enjoy it, the wordplay and style, when he interviewed the famous socialist writer Michael Harrington, who was kind of one of Bill Buckley's many friendly adversaries. Bill Buckley was the all-time Olympian in the world of friendly adversaries. And Bill Buckley did all of that. He had a research staff at National Review. Neil Freeman was one. They were on National Review payroll. And so he kept the expenses really low. So the money they got from the government, and everyone understood this was a great public service, his program. I mean, the government was not going to be subsidizing it the way they did unless this was a really respected program. Look who was on it. Candidates Nixon and Reagan were on it. Ex-candidate Barry Goldwater, all nominees or elected presidents, not to mention Muhammad Ali and the leaders of the Black Panthers. You almost can't believe it was on that show. Groucho Marx. It was just one big name after another, and Buckley was great with them all. And so he got paid a lot of money, and then he made sure it went to National Review. And in 1980, after the climactic victory for his movement, which was Ronald Reagan's election for president. In 1980, there was a big banquet at the Plaza Hotel in New York. And Buckley gave one of his great after-dinner speeches. To my mind, I've heard audio of Bill Buckley going back to the 1960s before he was on television. If there was a better after-dinner speaker than William F. Buckley Jr., I'd like to know who it was. And because he captivated a room. And to be in his presence, you knew him, was the same thing. He had that larger-than-life quality of attracting interest. And he stood up before 700 diners at the Plaza Hotel. And those diners include people like Henry Kissinger, the columnist George Will, a 60 Minutes crew. Morley Safer was a correspondent. He's moving through the audience with a microphone. And Bill Buckley says, those of you who think it's easy to do what I do and it comes cheap, I will tell you, $6 million of my dollars went to keep this magazine going. And a lot of those $6 million, Brian, came out of firing line.
Please excuse us for interrupting. We'll continue our conversation in a minute. Let me ask you about some people that today no one ever talks about very much, but you have it in your book. When I was a very young disc jockey in a small radio station in Lafayette, Indiana, every Sunday night I had to push the Mutual Broadcasting Network button to bring up some guy I had no idea who he was, Clarence Mannion.
Oh,
I didn't
wow.
pay attention to who he was. It didn't matter to me at the time. But reading your book, you got to tell us about Clarence Mannion.
Clarence Dean Mannion, as he was called, because he had been the dean of the Notre Dame Law School. He was one of the founders of the modern conservative movement and one of the first to go on the radio doing just the program you mentioned. Mannion was someone who had been a professor of law at Notre Dame, and like so many of the generation of conservatives slightly older than Bill Buckley was surrounded by ex-leftists. That really formed the basis of National Review. Some of them were communists, like Whitaker Chambers and James Burnham. They'd been members of the Communist Party who'd been converted, right, or deconverted from communism, became men of the right. Dean Mannion was not on the staff of National Review, but he was on its board of directors. And he had been a New Deal liberal who then became disillusioned and moved steadily to the right. And he had been appointed by President Eisenhower when he was elected. Remember, Eisenhower was the first Republican president elected since Herbert Hoover in 1928. Although the Democrats had won the next 5 elections. And then Eisenhower won, and he was kind of an ambiguous figure. It's one reason the party chose him. He wasn't identified with either party. He was a war hero. So the Republicans thought this is someone the country would vote for, and they were right. And so when he took office in 1953, he created a small agency, an intergovernment agency, one of these agencies that we never think about until someone like Elon Musk comes along and says he wants to get rid of them. And the function of Dean Mannion's group was to reassess the relationship between the federal government and the states, because that had been the big transformation that occurred under first Franklin Roosevelt and then his successor, Harry Truman, was to make the government more centralized. And of course, the complaint of conservatives in this era was that big government was getting too big and too centralized. They call it statism. And Mannion was brought in by Eisenhower to sit on an advisory committee, but instead became kind of a strident voice of criticism. He criticized the government under Eisenhower for perpetuating New Deal policies and programs, which Eisenhower did in a very pragmatic way, because he thought that's what the country wanted. And also, he opposed the one worldism, as it was called then, what today is called globalism of the United Nations. And he did this so stridently, became so noisy or voluble, an in-house critic, the administration, that he was fired. And with that firing became kind of famous. So if you look at the Chicago Tribune at the time, you'll see a great big giant headline, Dean Mannion fired. And then what did he do? He went into media. There's a very good book by one of the new generation of scholars who write about the conservative movement called Messengers of the Right. The author is Nicole Hemmer. She's a professor now at Vanderbilt University. And she wrote a book in which Mannion is a major figure. You probably know this book. And she says he was one of the first to see that media could be a way to reach the public. He did it on the radio. And Bill Buckley was a guest. Joe McCarthy was a guest. So he became very important. And when National Review was founded, Bill Buckley brought him onto the board. And then later, that the magazine was founded in 1955. 6 or 7 years later, when there was a crisis in the movement because of the perceived threat presented by Robert Welch, the leader of the John Birch Society, who was seen as kind of a fringe extremist, and Whether or not he was, I think most people would say his views were extreme. How dangerous a person was he? Probably not dangerous at all. But he was a really easy target for liberals because he was a conspiracy theorist. Of course, we don't have those any longer in our politics. And the conspiracy in his case included Eisenhower himself, who he accused of being a communist agent, a Soviet agent. So Buckley and others, including Barry Goldwater, and kind of on the fringe, Ronald Reagan, but more important than either of them, Russell Kirk, and maybe we'll get a chance to talk about him. Russell Kirk, one of the great conservative writers and thinkers of the time, they agreed Robert Welch had to be read out of the movement. So whom do they consult? Bill Buckley talks to Dean Mannion, because Dean Mannion is a friend of Welch and a friend of Buckley, and Dean Mannion tried to keep Buckley from doing it. He said, if you drive Welch out of the movement, you're going to alienate all his followers and supporters, the grassroots people we need for our movement, and it'll be a mistake. And Bill Buckley decided things had gone too far, and he differed with Dean Mannion on that. He went his own way, but that shows you how important Mannion was.
I want to read a paragraph from your book around this same. It's in the Radical Conservatives chapter, which is chapter 17. The editors, for their part, busily laid the groundwork for his successor, Senator Noland, who in the lead feature accused Eisenhower, at the recent Great Power Summit in Geneva of pursuing defeat in the Cold War through the grand appeasement of international communism. Dim-witted Ike was no better than Truman, like him, the helpless witness, the stooge of Stalin's men as they bullied their way across the globe, enslaving entire peoples. In China, they had brought some 700 million people under tyranny, the most ferocious the world had ever seen. Senator Noland of California. Who was he?
And by the way, Brian, when you say successor, they meant successor to Joe McCarthy, because McCarthy had been brought down, and McCarthy had been the figure that Buckley and others rallied around. Without McCarthy, there would be no National Review, because he gave them their first populist voice and brought people into the movement. So now they needed another leader. And they liked William Noland, who was from California, as you say. He was an interesting figure because he was a protege of both Earl Warren, the great Republican progressive, and also he was a follower of McCarthy. And I wouldn't say protege of McCarthy, but an ally and a protege of Robert Taft, who was the most admired figure on the hard right at that time. What they called old guard conservatives. Taft died in 1953, and he had tapped Noland as his successor. He became the leading Republican senator and briefly was the Senate majority leader when Republicans had a majority in the mid-50s. Noland came from California. He was from Oakland. His father was the publisher of the Oakland Tribune, which was the paper in that city, very conservative, and yet supported Earl Warren. Earl Warren, in that older period, we think of him for the great Supreme Court decision, the Brown decision, and the later increasingly liberal decisions. But he came out of the Reform Republican Party in California. Just shows you how politics gets complicated.
What about the fact that, and I don't think this is in your book, I looked up Noland, he committed suicide at 65. Did you track that at all?
I did. Noland had a complicated personal life. He and his wife had for a while a kind of, what was then maybe still called an open marriage in the 1950s. And both got involved with other people. And Noland didn't want to stop when his wife did. And that became gossip that circulated in Washington, D.C. That was one reason, Brian, that Noland decided it might be a good idea to run for governor of California rather than stay in Washington. But there was a second reason he did, and that was because he had a rival in the Senate from California who was smarter and far more devious and younger, and he was Richard Nixon. And Nixon was trying to angle Noland out of the way. Nixon had overtaken Noland for the vice presidency under Eisenhower. Eisenhower had considered Noland, Nixon, and Earl Warren as vice presidential nominees because Warren had challenged him. He'd been one of the contenders in 52. And Nixon won. Nixon was the youngest. He was the most forceful and dynamic. And he was also the most, what shall we say, pragmatic, Machiavellian in maneuvering his way onto the ticket. But he saw Noland as a threat. Noland was still there in California. Noland was respected in a way Nixon was not. Nixon was vice president. Nobody liked him very much, beginning with Eisenhower. Eisenhower tried to kick him off the ticket twice, first in 52 and then in 56. Nixon was hard to get rid of. So Nixon decided he had a solution for the Noland problem, and that was to encourage him to run for governor of California. And he ran against the figure we refer to as Pat Brown, Edmund G. Brown, the father of Jerry Brown, who was a very popular Democratic governor of California. Noland challenged him in 1958, an election that was a devastating midterm setback for the Republicans. It was the last election held under President Eisenhower, and the Republicans had gotten used to winning. But Eisenhower was too liberal for them. So they ran to the right of him. Noland did. He ran on an anti-union right to work, not right to life. That came later. Right to work program, anti-union. And it was absolutely demolished in that election. Noland was too much a Washington figure. Senators often have this problem when they go back home. In California, they called it Potomac fever. Remember, in those days, most people still traveled across the country by train, not plane. And there were no jet planes. So it took a long time to get from California to Washington. And if you were in Washington, you were not going to be going home every weekend. And Noland had this kind of senatorial mien about him. The florid speeches and the wavy hair, all the things that people made fun of in senators. Bob Caro was a great set piece on it in Masters of the Senate. Senator Claghorn, these kind of blowhard types. And Noland really fit that category. And Buckley and company liked him so much because he was really militantly anti-communist. And in California, anti-communism meant really being anti-China. It was called the China lobby because of geographical proximity. They're not really looking at Russia. They're looking at China, across the Pacific. And Noland was a leader in that group. So National Review thought maybe he could be their guy.
Let me ask you about Sam Tanenhaus. 27 years that you were somewhere, somehow staying in this story. How did you live?
Well, for 14, was it, of those years? No, a dozen of those years. I was on the staff of the New York Times. When I signed the contract in 1998, I had just been hired full-time as an editor on the op-ed page of the New York Times. That is the editorial side of the paper. Then I left to become what was called a contributing editor, which meant contract writer for Vanity Fair magazine. And I did that for a number of years. And I had very little experience doing either of those things. So I had a lot of on-the-job training to do. And then after I had written several articles for Vanity Fair, mostly about politics, but also about culture. I have literary interests as well. I like to write about literary figures and cultural figures. After I'd written a number of stories for them, profiles, I went back to the New York Times in 2004 to become the editor of the New York Times Book Review. And I did that until 2013, but I stayed at the paper. Simultaneously with editing the New York Times Book Review, I edited what was then called the Sunday Weekend Review. I think it's called Sunday Opinion or something today. So I did both those sections. I believe, I was told at the time, I was the only person who ever had both those jobs at once, which meant there were a lot of great people around me who were doing most of the work. I'm just kind of, running interference or writing stories myself. So, but those are pretty, demanding day jobs. And also during that time, I was working on the book, but educating myself in the conservative movement. The first big biography I wrote, which you know very well, we talked about it all those years ago, on Whitaker Chambers, was almost a kind of autobiography. It certainly doesn't read that way. I don't want to think anybody to get the impression it's written in the first person or I'm a figure in it. It's just that the topics and themes were issues I'd grown up with in my own family. My father was a professor, political science, who was made his career in the 1950s and 60s. And what in that period was known, the terms have kind of faded away. He was what was called an anti-communist liberal or a Cold War liberal. That is someone who favored all the domestic programs of Democrats, but was very much an anti-communist. And he had introduced me to Chambers and the debates, his case, when I was very young. So I kind of grew up aware of that world. When I started writing about Bill Buckley, who came out of a very different background and tradition, I had a lot to learn about the American conservative movement in the Buckley era. I mean, I'd observed it from afar, the way many of us do, but I didn't know who the big players were, what the arguments were. So a lot of time was spent investigating people like that, James Burnham and Frank Meyer and Wilmore Kendall, these figures that I knew only as names and sometimes didn't even know the names. So I was doing that a lot of the time, doing a lot of reading, thinking, and studying to be ready to tell this story. Also, William F. Buckley was alive all this time. He died in 2008, 10 years after I'd signed the contract. And I am aware of only one truly great biography written of a living person, and it's the one about an inch over your head on that back shelf. It's Robert Caro's The Power Broker. People forget his subject, Robert Moses, was alive when that book was published. The reason people forget he was alive was because Caro, in effect, I don't mean to be facetious, but kind of killed him off. He finished him in that book. Well, Bill Buckley was nowhere near ready to be finished off, and I certainly was not going to do that. So I couldn't really get started on it in a serious way until Bill Buckley died. So now you're shortening the time frame from about 2008 to 2023 when I completed the manuscript. Because when you write a big book like this, it takes a long time to get it through the stages of publication.
Please excuse us for interrupting. We'll continue our conversation in a minute.
You report in your book that when Bill Buckley decided to turn the editorship over to somebody else, that they talked about David Brooks and David Frum and ended up with Rich Lowry. Why? What was going on about David Brooks and David Frum that they weren't asked to be the editor?
One of the documents I found, it was given to me by another person who was important in the movement, but is not well remembered today, was one of Bill Buckley's very best friends from Yale, a guy named Evan Galbraith. Van Galbraith, he was called, not to be confused with another Buckley Galbraith friend, John Kenneth Galbraith. Van Galbraith was a guy who made a fortune on Wall Street. He was a lawyer, an investor. He also was a publisher for a while of National Review. He was really their lawyer for many years. And before Van Galbraith died, he invited me to his home on the Upper East Side of Manhattan and gave me a box full of documents. And he said, look, Bill told me you're writing this book, so here's the material I have. And I interviewed him at length. Then he gave me this box of material. And in it, I found old style dot matrix printout of an email Bill Buckley had sent to Van Galbraith and the other board members of National Review in 1997, I think it was, in which he described Bill Buckley had retired from the magazine. There had already been another editor in between, a John O'Sullivan, who was from England. And he was there for a while, and Bill Buckley decided it was time to make a move. It was time for yet another editor. So he went to Washington to do a kind of listening tour. Bill Buckley was very good at this, sizing up situations and reaching strong conclusions, making judgments. And one of the people he talked to was another of his many, many gifted proteges, George Will, the great Washington Post columnist, who amazingly is still doing it, still writing great columns. It's a marvel of our time. And George Will had been a protege of Buckley. And in the memo, he wrote the report back to Van Galbraith and the other board members at National Review. Bill Buckley said, well, I went to Washington and I talked to all the people at the Weekly Standard. That was the big new magazine then. It's not in print any longer. But it was the first direct challenger to National Review. National Review is published in New York, and Weekly Standard came out of Washington. And National Review had begun as a weekly, but they couldn't afford to keep it going as such. And the expenses are very high with the weekly magazine. They switched to what was then called, in elegant language, a fortnightly. It came out every 2 weeks. And that happened in the late 50s, and it remained one ever since. But here was a Weekly Standard, which was the big new boy in the block. And Bill Buckley talked to its editor and publisher, Bill Crystal, William Crystal, the son of Bill Buckley's good friend, Irving Crystal. And they talked it over, who's available. And Bill Crystal was very generous. He said, sure, you can talk to the people on my staff. And two of the people on his staff, this was a high-powered operation. Another writer for the Weekly Standard, some people will remember, although not as a writer, was Tucker Carlson, who was actually one of the most talented journalists to come out of that generation. He was a really good profile writer. He was a follower of Tom Wolfe, a very clever, amusing profile writer before he became the Tucker Carlson we know today. Well, Bill Buckley talked to several proteges there of his own whom he'd known one way or another. David Brooks had been at National Review. He'd been a kind of intern at National Review. Bill Buckley had discovered him in the 80s. David Frum had been a superstar at Yale. And Buckley was a big Yale guy. And many of his proteges and disciples came from Yale. Also, his sailing companions often came from Yale. And Christopher Buckley, Bill Buckley's son, had told him, you should talk to this David Frum. This guy's off the charts brilliant. And David Frum was from Toronto, means he's Canadian. They'd already had a British editor. They're not sure they want a Canadian. David Brooks was American, but he and David Frum both had something in common that Bill Buckley was uncomfortable with as the editor of his magazine. They were Jewish. And I have to tell you, Brian, when I talked to another exceptional young journalist I've gotten to know quite well, Robert Costa, the Washington Post reporter, who's now a CBS political correspondent, he began as an intern at National Review. People don't remember this. And then a writer for them. Robert Costa was a brilliant reporter for National Review. And he told me when he read that passage in my book, shocked by that. Because what Bill Buckley said, and I have to be very careful with Bill Buckley, who chose his words, with great precision. He didn't say we cannot have a Jewish editor of National Review. What he said was, George Will agreed with me that the editor should be a believing Christian. So that enabled him to say, well, there are a lot of Christians I wouldn't put in charge of this magazine either because they're not believing. But Bob Costa, when he read that, he told me, or asked me, what about Bill Buckley, the guy who supposedly drove the Semites out of the magazine. And I don't see it as anti-Semitic. Commentary magazine is not going to appoint a Protestant. It was a belief that he had, but that was why he didn't want either of those two. Now, I have to say, I find it very unlikely that David Brooks would have accepted the editorship of National Review. He was already becoming famous as a writer. He wasn't an opinion writer yet, but he was emerging as a consequential commentator and observer on the American scene, not somebody who's going to subordinate that work to being an editor. Bill Buckley was a phenom, so he could do everything at once. A comparison today would be David Remnick at the New York. Right. Remnick is publishing this very important magazine with all these brilliant writers, but he can get on the plane, fly to Israel, and on the flight back, write 10, exquisite, sophisticated pages on what's going on in Gaza. That's David Remnick. Buckley was like that too. But most people aren't. I don't think David Brooks would have accepted the job. But I'll tell you, when I first reported that incident, it was before the book came out. It was in the New Republic magazine. I did a profile for them of William F. Buckley, who was still alive at that point. I think it was 2007. David Frum sent me a note, and he said, the subject line was, "Your bombshell." He said, "You must be hearing from people about this." And I had to tell him I wasn't. People hardly noticed it. That's why books are really important. A magazine article comes and goes. There are other facts in the book that I've published in magazines, and at the time, nobody noticed. But once they're in a book where you have more length, that you set up context, it makes more of a reaction. David Frum, I'm going to do his program. He does a podcast, and I'm going to ask him, if I get the opportunity, David, had you been offered the editorship of National Review in 1997, would you have accepted it? So America, wait. You'll get to hear me ask him that question.
Let me ask you about reviewing, because on the day we're talking, the Associated Press published the fact that they will no longer review books. And as you know, Associated Press goes around the world. And the New York Times still reviews books, although it seems to have changed very much since you were there.
Yeah.
I looked up the review of your book in the New York Times, and I just wonder what it feels like when you've spent 27 years on a book and you have somebody write that Tanenhaus's case for Buckley's significance is mostly tact, as the book curiously lacks a formal introduction. Why would a reviewer waste time saying something like that? What difference does it make?
Well, I can't comment on, I don't know that reviewer. Actually, I was in touch with her at one point because she wrote a book about Ayn Rand, who figures in the story. And I was in touch with two of the biographers of Ayn Rand, this reviewer and also Ann Heller, whom I got to know and gave me some interesting documentation. I don't know why she would say that. And so I don't want to get into the motives of reviewers. What I will say is, speaking of David Frum, I saw him in Washington around the time the book came out, and he said, I'll tell you why you don't write an introduction to a book like that. Because people think all they have to do is read the introduction and they don't have to read the book. And of course, I did experiment with introductions. I went back and looked at one of them the other day because there's a lot of material I had to cut. This was my decision. But at one point I had an introductory chapter, and I thought, this is a storybook. Not that I've made things up, but this is the story of a great life. It's not an academic treatise on William F. Buckley. I'm not going to tell you what you are supposed to think about him. I want you to try to experience his life. And I had an interesting encounter with the Whitaker Chambers book, which also doesn't have an introduction, and no one seemed to object to that at the time. Well, one reason it has no introduction or a prologue, I don't use prologues either, is my idol, one of my 3 or 4 idols. It was the great editor, Bob Loomis. I think you interviewed him more than once.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
He's deceased.
distinguished,
Yeah.
revered editor. And he was a kind of father figure to me. And when I was working on Whitaker Chambers, and I was a pretty young guy then, I was in early 30s. And he said, no, you don't do a prologue. Because I've been reading all these biographies that had them. And I said, well, why not? And he said, that indicates you think you're playing with a weak hand. You think you have to jumpstart your story if you do a prologue. You don't do it. So, okay.
Bob Evans was with Random House, and you dedicate your book to him. But the woman that wrote this piece in the New York Times to review your book is Jennifer Burns, who's an associate professor at Stanford. But she then says something in her review that the right wing, who are Buckley supporters, are not happy about. And she said that you had insight and understood him as the right's first intellectual entertainer. And as you know, some of the reviews written by the conservative press, they don't want him to be called an intellectual entertainer.
Yeah, they don't. Let me finish another thing first, but I wanted to say something about introductions and appendixes. Another reason I didn't do it was the Chambers book does have, while it has no introduction or prologue, it has an appendix in which I summarize all the evidence in the Algerhes case. And where the state of art then, because there had been new documentation that had come out of the Soviet Union and Russian archives as well as U.S. archives. And a quite good journalist sent me a note, and he said, well, I haven't read your book, but I read that appendix on his case. And I thought, okay, no more appendixes, no introductions, tell the story. The entertainer question is an interesting one, Brian, because my answer to that is, that's a bad thing that William Buckley brought excitement and enthusiasm to the movement. One of the most famous profiles of William Buckley, magazine profiles, is in Time magazine with an illustration by the great David Levine that became famous for his illustrations in the New York Review of Books. And remember the cover of that profile of Buckley. Buckley was on the cover of Time magazine, which, as Donald Trump will remind you, in a certain time was the biggest thing you could achieve in American culture, especially if you were a literary person. Norman Mailer and John Updike, figures like that were on the cover. Here's William Buckley, and it asked the question, can conservatism be fun? And that was the genius of Bill Buckley, is that he made it entertaining. It doesn't diminish him. It enlarged him. That's why he went on firing line and pulled people in. Do you remember Ray Price, the speechwriter for Richard Nixon? I bet you knew him very well. I interviewed Ray Price. One advantage of a book that takes so long to write is you talk to people alive who've now entered history. And I tell people the best example of that is I actually interviewed Bill Buckley's childhood piano teacher, who was 92 when I interviewed her in 2003, died shortly thereafter. Well, Ray Price, who became a famous speechwriter for Richard Nixon, and before that had been the editorial page editor of the Herald Tribune, another forgotten publication that had been the voice of moderate conservatism, of moderate Republican Party, Eisenhower Republicanism. He said to me, he'd known Buckley since they were at Yale together. He held him in awe. And he said, the best, most important thing Bill Buckley ever did was to go in firing line, because that meant, to start that program, that meant every week liberals on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, because Buckley was so charismatic you couldn't not watch him. They'd turn on the television and see that he was smarter than they were. Like, how does he speak that way? How does he answer so quickly? How does he find the hole in people's arguments? Maybe he's onto something I don't know. That you can do if you're out there in the world. So I also quote one of Bill Buckley's beloved Yale professors, the philosopher Paul Weiss, who said to Gary Wills, not George Will, the other famous, similar sounding name, protege Gary Wills, a great historian. Paul Weiss said to him, Bill is very good at talking about books he hasn't read. Most journalists don't read all the way through books. You don't have time to do it. The great Walter Lippmann, probably the most respected columnist of the 20th century. Walter Lippmann was one of my father's idols. He was also an idol, I learned, to Bill Buckley's own mentor, Wilmore Kendall, the political scientist. When Kendall was young, someone found his letters and published them. He said he wanted to be the next Walter Lippmann. Well, when Lippmann was a very famous columnist for the New York World, his publisher said to him, Walter, you quote and cite so many books in your columns that readers would want to know about. Why don't you do an end of the year roundup of the books people should read? And Lippmann said, I've read some of many books. In other words, he wasn't reading the books. So Bill Buckley's ability to grasp an argument without actually reading all the way through a book or even much of it, that's a son of a remarkable intellect. That is not a put down. And I'm surprised. There's another phrase, Brian, maybe you were going to bring it up because a lot of reviewers have picked up on it. Beginning with the first of my book, beginning with the first very long essay, it may still be the longest essay written on the book, was one published just before it came out in the New Yorker magazine by Luke Menand, as people call him. And he have homed in on a phrase I had for Bill Buckley. So it's being recycled all the time. It was performing ideologue. And people say, and this is probably what Professor Burns is referring to, is Buckley the performer. And I'm thinking, performing ideologue is not a put down. The emphasis is on performer. Buckley could take very dry sounding arguments and ideas and make them interesting and alive to think about and talk about. Does anybody really have a problem with that? I've never met a serious intellectual, and I think I've gotten to know a lot of them because of the work I do, who ever said to me, Bill Buckley did not have a first-rate mind. I've never heard anyone say it.
In the aftermath of the book being published, there were several reviews. One of those that was in the National Review was by a man you quote often in your book, Neil Freeman. And one of the first things that he writes on that I wanted to ask you about, he said he talked to Bill Buckley in 2006, and Bill was disappointed about how slow the book was coming. When you read that from Neil Freeman, your reaction?
I hadn't read it until you just told me. There's been so much of that, Brian, I haven't had a chance to read it. But I do know Bill was disappointed because, and when I call him Bill, by the way, it's just because that's what everyone who came into his orbit called him. It's not to pretend a kind of familiarity that I didn't have. When my wife, Kathy, and I talk about Bill Buckley, we always call him Bill. We were in his home, we met him, and that's what you did. Well, I saw him, and I record this in the book, just before he died. And he said to me, this was 2008, and he said to me, I know I'm not going to see my biography. And I've always regretted, I do not have a quick mind like Bill Buckley. And I felt devastated by that. And so I couldn't come back. I couldn't formulate the response I really wanted to give him. And so I'll say it now, that you won't see it, but I will do my level best to do you justice. Now, there are many people, and I guess Neil is one of them, who think I didn't do that. Someone who did is Christopher Buckley, his son, Bill Buckley's only son, who was really the sponsor of the project in many ways. He was the one who really wanted me to do it and I'd gotten to know WFB, the other way of referring to him, very well. But both Christopher and WFB really liked the Chambers book, and they thought it would make sense for me to do it. Well, Christopher Buckley had to sign off on all the quotations in the book. He's the literary executor. And if he had had a problem with the book, he could have said to me, because I never got a signed agreement. I was too naive to do it. And it just hadn't crossed my mind since Buckley, father and son, both wanted me to do it. Bill Buckley had opened up his archive to me, given me personal papers no one else had ever seen, like his personal diary, a diary which means a calendar. He was not somebody who jotted his private musings down. All his musings were public, and you can see them in his books. His best books are his memoirs.
Did Bill Buckley underwrite any of your expenses in writing this book?
Absolutely not. Although he didn't even want me to pick up checks when we had lunch. It's because that's how he lived. He didn't like other people subsidizing anything he did. I think it was a little surprise to some people to find in the book that he hated having to find donors and backers for National Review. He said, I'm a rotten salesman and I hate doing it because people thought, well, he must be a genius of a fundraiser. He actually really struggled to do it. He did what he had to do, but he was not happy doing it. And he didn't like the idea that somebody else was going to pay the check. I mean, it was just how he was. But he and foundations he was involved in or knew of helped with the Chambers book, because that one had very small advance. And I was just starting out. And I didn't have the opportunities I had when I was working on the Buckley biography, which was, a pretty good job at the New York Times, or articles I would publish in big magazines, and, different ways one has of generating enough income to keep going. I mean, not to get rich by any means, but just to keep going. Do this. And I had a pretty good advance for this, and a budget. All these, and an expense budget, which became very important when we had to pay for photographs. Yeah.
Where do you live now?
I live in Essex, Connecticut, which is very close to the Connecticut shoreline. It's about 35 minutes away from New Haven on Interstate 95, which is called north but really means east, where it's a beautiful little town near the Connecticut River. And Christopher Buckley told me that the last sailboat his father bought was built in Essex. There are a lot of shipbuilders here. There are a lot of yachtsmen. I get seasick. I'm not a yachtsman. It was tough for me to go on Bill Buckley's boat. But it's a beautiful little town and a great place to write a book. Very quiet.
There's a point in the book where you and your wife, Kathy, you say this in the book, are meeting with Bill Buckley, and I don't have the page open, but he wept. And there was more than one occasion in the book where Bill Buckley wept. Was he a crier?
He was a man of very deep feeling, I'll tell you that. And the occasion you're talking about was after his beloved wife, Pat Buckley, had died in the spring of 2007. And it was devastating to Bill. He did not live much longer than that. And Bill Buckley was very much at ease with women. He was one of 10 children. He was the third of four sons, just like Robert Kennedy, by the way, the third of four sons. Robert Kennedy and Bill Buckley were born 4 or 5 days apart. They're parallel figures, and they eyed each other very interestingly, and there was a little bit of that in the book. But the sibling born before him and the one born after, his older sister Jane and his younger sister Trish, who became Patricia Buckley Bozell, married Bill Buckley's best friend from Yale and was co-author and kind of co-founder of the movement. They were the siblings he was closest to. So he's very much at ease with women. And he really felt comfortable with Kathy. And when I went to see him on this last visit, he was just visibly disappointed that she was there. Now, look, she's my better half. I get that. Most people would rather see Kathy than see me. Fully understand it. But also, Buckley felt comfortable with her. So on this earlier visit, which he'd also told us he was contemplating suicide, which was something that also made people around Bill Buckley very nervous, because he was the most admired Catholic intellectual of his time, probably, certainly the most famous. He was a conservative Catholic. Catholics do not commit suicide. And he talked us through. He said he'd spoken with priests, and they said, if you're really struggling, and he was suffering from emphysema, diabetes, he'd been in the hospital, he was weak, he had oxygen tanks in his house. It's a struggle for him to get through each day. They said to him, if you're really struggling, and you decide not to prolong your life, that is okay. And but then he told us how difficult it had been for him when Pat Buckley was in the hospital dying. And he said, and I record instances of this throughout the book because it told you a lot about Bill Buckley, and his siblings were very aware of it. Again, especially his sisters. Is he hated hospitals, and he hated being in the company of people who were really ill and dying. And so he said to us about Pat, he said, I couldn't be in the room with her. And he wept. I'm a guy. I don't know what to do. What does my wife do? She just goes over and hugs him. That's what he needed there. And when we'd had a meal privately at a restaurant he used to like to go near his home in Stamford. This is a classic Bill Buckley. He'd say, well, let's meet halfway at this restaurant. The restaurant was 5 minutes from his house and 40 minutes from mine, but that was halfway. And he told me that same story. He said, I couldn't be with him. So he was a crier. He was a man of feeling. To me, that was the biggest discovery I made about Bill Buckley, was that for all the fancy words and ingenious arguments and all the erudition, the authors he could cite and quote, he responded to life through his feelings. That's why the epigraph of the book, which I had not realized, but I learned the other day because I haven't been following the reviews closely enough, has apparently offended some people, is a magnificent passage from, in my view, the greatest of all novelists, Marcel Proust, who said that our beliefs begin in our feelings and not with facts. And so somebody said to me, well, are you saying Bill Buckley didn't always change his mind according to the facts? And I said, yeah, he didn't change his mind, and most people don't. You know, we know what we feel. And Buckley was very much a man of feeling. That's why when he did change his mind, it was because he came face to face with people. You know, that's how he changed his mind about civil rights and race. He met Jesse Jackson in Chicago, the very young Jesse Jackson. He's totally knocked out by him. He brings him to New York and introduces him to all his friends. That's why he had him on firing line. It's why the liberal Democrat, Allard Lowenstein, became one of Buckley's favorite guests. I think he was on firing line 9 times. And Bill Buckley delivered the eulogy at his funeral. Allard Lowenstein was a left-wing Democrat. He would have thought Bernie Sanders and AOC weren't far enough to the left. Bill Buckley supported him when he ran for Congress because he liked him. He thought he was smart. And that's the Bill Buckley the world should know. Not the guy who pins on the door of the liberal cathedrals all the sins of liberalism. Yeah, he did that, but that's not what made him a big figure. What made him a big figure was the size and scope of his life and personality. So what I say sometimes, a National Review or someplace said, well, a flawed portrait. And another reviewer, National Review, who really knew Bill Buckley very well was Richard Brookhiser. And he says a man in full, which is interesting because Brookhiser knew Buckley very well. He was a disciple and protege. And Buckley had considered him at one point to be the next editor of the magazine and decided against it. Well, Rick Brookhiser knew there were many sides to Bill Buckley. He wasn't just the leader of a movement. He wasn't just a guy who adhered to 10 or 12 principles spelled out in the Sharon Statement that found the founding document for the Young Americans for Freedom, or what was in the latest Republican platform statement back in the days when the party actually would issue a platform statement. That life is more complicated than that. People are more complicated than that. And that's where Bill Buckley was most at home. And so he was very much a man of spontaneous reaction, of feeling, of sentiment. I realized it was a greater disappointment to Bill Buckley when his prized discovery, Gary Wills, turned against the movement and against Bill Buckley himself, and they later kind of became reconciled. And I can talk about that. It was an important moment for me in the writing of the Chambers book and led me to the Buckley book. But that disappointment mattered as much to Bill Buckley as Barry Goldwater's defeat to Lyndon Johnson in 1964, because he was a man of letters, of thought, of feeling, of sentiment, of aesthetic value. He's a different kind of figure, you know? And that's how you see the wholeness in Buckley. It's one reason it took so long to write the book. It's not just a matter of accumulating the facts. It's a matter of feeling where the story goes, feeling how the life is changing. And his was changing all the time.
We've gone over time because it's a long book. No, we've gone over time.
Got a big mouth.
And Sam Tanenhaus has been our guest, and the name of this book is Just Plain Buckley. Thank you, Sam Tanenhaus, for spending time with us.
What a pleasure to do this again, Brian. You look better than ever. I wish I could say the same for myself.
Thanks for tuning into this week's Booknotes Plus podcast. If you have a moment, please consider rating and reviewing us wherever you listen to podcasts. Your feedback will help others discover the program. And don't forget to share this episode with friends and family. For the latest on new episodes, schedule updates, and more, follow us on X @C-SPAN Radio.